Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark-Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Have you ever had this experience where you have bought a new pair of shoes or you bought a new car, and now all of a sudden, everywhere you go throughout your day, throughout your life, you're noticing that pair of shoes, that car, that product, that whatever that you just have engaged with in your life, you start noticing everywhere.
And it feels like all of a sudden everybody decided to buy your car.
Yeah, and you're like, man, I thought it was so unique.
I did this when we named our daughter Piper.
I was just thinking the same thing, yeah.
Like, we were like, ooh, it's so unique. And then all of a sudden, like, TV show characters and like
random people that I meet now are named Piper.
Yeah, and so it was frustrating at first because we thought we were, I mean, it wasn't just the uniqueness of it, but we actually legitimately liked the name Piper, but it was frustrating because we thought that we had done something unique, and then it felt like Pipers were everywhere. And the truth is that Pipers aren't everywhere. I mean, if you go to an amusement park and look for a key ring that says Piper, you're going to be SOL, because there's really just not enough Pipers to justify it. But just like when you buy a new car or you purchase something or name your kid a specific unique name, all of a sudden everybody has that thing. And it's not the reality is not that thing is now prolific. It's that your subjective reality is now seeing it. It's looking for it, and so it's now spotting it because it's familiar to you. And that is what is called a cognitive bias. Our minds have these programs in them, these scripts that they're running from really ancient wiring, right? Like this wiring in our heads it's from so long ago. And because we have these scripts running all the time, and each of these scripts do something very specific for us. But one of the things they do is they give birth to multiple cognitive biases. Non-contextual, like biases or these scripts running are great contextually. But when we take them out of context, they can actually be extremely harmful. So one of the things we wanted to talk about in this podcast today is how these scripts work, why we run them in the first place, and in what ways can they mess us up, and how can they actually do good for us as well.
Yeah, and the reason this came up for us, we're right in the middle. We are in the thick of it this week, doing a lot of business stuff on the back end, the things you don't see. When you're listening to this podcast, we have obviously an online business where we sell programs and products and services and things. And so we are in a scale-up moment, and we're bringing on some new people that are coming on the team. And we're in the process this week of working with one of our newest team members, Charis, who's actually here with us on the podcast today, in setting up some business systems, business processes, and all of that. So it was really, as we were talking about setting up processes and streamlining things, we got into this conversation about how our brains sometimes do the same thing to make things more easy, more palatable, and streamlined for us.
Right. Well, so Charis is visiting right now because the benefits of having an online virtual business is that the people who work with you can literally be anywhere on the planet. So Charis actually lives in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We're in Somerset, Pennsylvania right now, and Charis is in Gettysburg, which is about, what does it take you, about 3 hours to get here?
2.5 hours.
Hi, Charis.
Hi.
Come on in here and say hi.
Hello, everybody.
Right, so it took you about 3 hours to get here. And so this week, we've just been completely focusing on it. And basically, you actually work with Joel more than me.
Right.
So what have you and Joel been working on?
We've just been, I've been learning the business from the ground up, basically, and we're trying to streamline processes and just kind of figure out how to make things simpler for me to be able to take care of some of these things for you guys.
Right.
What's great about Charis is, Antonia's an ENTP in the Myers-Briggs system. I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system. So Charis is actually an INFJ in the Myers-Briggs system. So she has perspectives harmony in the Genius system as her mental processes. And she is great to round us out because we're both really extroverted and really, free form. And
yeah.
Charis brings a stabilizing force, I think, of, she is methodical, she's thoughtful, she's stabilizing. And she's
bossy.
Bossy, she's a planner. I love having her around because she brings that whole other element. And, oftentimes we attract a lot of, judger type people, INFJs, INTJs, people like this to the business, to the podcast. So it's nice to have somebody around that can help us make sure we're hitting all bases on that front.
Yeah, well, because we're pretty freeform, like you said, and Cherries is on the stick.
And I'm very glad to be here.
Yeah. So these script, getting back to the topic, these scripts that you were talking about that you guys are running, basically they're processes so that they can be replicable. Because in previous times it was just Joel and I, so there were a lot of things that we did that we would try to create a procedure for or process for. But it was like we didn't write it down, or we didn't make that video that like reminded us how we did it the last time. So every time we had to do it, it was like slightly different. And we're always trying to figure out the right way to do it. And then we bring on somebody like Cheris, who is not going to be okay with doing it differently. You know, like every time you do this procedure, it's going to be different. Like
reinvent the wheel each time. Yeah,
that's ridiculous, right?
Oh yeah.
So what we've been forced to do, especially Joel, has been forced to do is actually create a process or procedure. So it's like, okay, so it's like, it's all of these if-then statements. You know, if this happens, then you do this, and then you do this. And then it turns the process or procedure basically mindless at that point, right? Like you just do it, right? Like this is the process. And what's so fascinating about that is that our brains naturally work that way. Our brains naturally work so that once we've figured out a way to do something internally, once our brain has gone, ooh, this is a really effective strategy, let's keep doing it this way. What happens is, I mean, we've talked about this before, I think in previous podcasts, is that on a physical level, like on a biological level, our brains are literally creating mental superhighways. Right? Like these neural pathways become a superhighway where the brain just goes, okay, so this is, whenever this thing gets triggered internally, we will always go down the superhighway. And in fact, it gets so protected. Like the brain decides that this is so important, it literally protects it with a layer of fats. I mean, there's technical names for all of this, but it's effectively a layer of fat that goes over this neural pathway that goes, okay, this one is really important, so we're not going to ever mess with it.
Yeah, I mean, a real basic example of this is when you drive to work in the morning or whatever time you go to work, you probably can get there without really thinking about it. You could be listening to the radio, to a podcast, to our podcast, whatever, and all of a sudden you show up at your work and you're like, if you had to think back all the different decisions you made to get there, your brain was probably on autopilot on your way. You probably went through different, not ran stoplights, but you were stopping at stoplights, you were turning at certain streets, you were stopping for coffee at that same place you stop at every morning. And you just did it. It was autopilot for you.
Yeah, I've actually had the experience where I drove to work one morning and I didn't know how I got there. And I was like, man, I'm really glad nobody stepped out in front of me because apparently my brain was completely shut off while I got from my home to my job. So we do this. We just go on autopilot and we just determine, okay, this is the best way of doing something, so I'm just going to keep doing it. Now that's conscious. Right? Like we do that consciously. We go, this is a really great way of doing this. I'm going to keep doing this. But on an unconscious level, our brains have already done this for us like 200,000 years ago. There are scripts that are run in that we just inherit. We inherit them biologically. We inherit them from our genes. And some of these scripts they're things like, we give more preference to our family members than to strangers. If our child is in peril and a stranger is in peril, our biology naturally has us or compels us to go save our child and not the stranger. So that's a script that has been running forever. That's super ancient programming. And that's like way pre-human, right? Like on a mammal level, that's important to us.
Sure.
So we've been running that script forever. And what's fascinating is that, like you and I, we recently looked up the Wikipedia article on cognitive biases. And by the way, if you have not yet done so, I highly recommend going to Wikipedia. They have a really comprehensive list of cognitive biases. Just take an afternoon, maybe print it out, go through it, mark some of the ones that you think you might be more of an offender of. Because we all do them all the time. I don't want to indicate in this podcast, and probably it's a good time to say, this is not something we can get away from. Cognitive biases are universal. Everybody's doing them all the time. In fact, just the mere fact that we're using language. There's a really fantastic book I think I've referenced before called Language in Thought and Action by H.I. Hayakawa. And it's it's basically sort of a study of how your mind, or how the mind gets wired differently depending upon the language that the person has been raised to speak. So people who have been raised to speak like Asian languages versus people who have been raised to speak, say, Latin languages, their wiring is actually substantially different. Their brain wiring is like shows up in kind of a, like a physical way. And so just the fact that we're using language, that we're choosing to use a specific language, already brings with it biases. So it's not really something you can get away from, right? Like, this is not a podcast to say, stop using cognitive biases. I don't really believe that that's a possibility. However, the more aware of them we are, the more we can make sure that when we are using biases, we're using them for good and not for evil. Or if they have been used in a way that's been destructive, we can go back and go, what just happened there? Like, why did I make an assumption that, led to me being unhappy? Or even, hey, why am I unhappy? Like, that might be the question. And then it could be rooted back to a bias. So that was a bit of a tangent. But the point of that originally was that we were looking up cognitive biases on Wikipedia. And there was something that it indicated that I thought was fascinating, which is that the same script, right? The same unconscious script that we're running, one like, that we have preference for things that are familiar to us, or that it is more important for, creatures or people that are closer to us in DNA, that we're going to give them preference when it comes to things like safety. Each one of these individual scripts can give birth to like 8 completely unrelated cognitive biases. So the original script is completely understandable and it's extremely useful and handy, and yet it's giving birth to all these unrelated biases because our brains are trying to get back to that original script. Our brains are trying to get back to, it's fundamentally trying to go, okay, so it's really important to keep our loved ones alive, right? So we're going to give preference to those that are familiar, which would give birth to maybe the cognitive bias called familiarity bias, which is when somebody says something that we've heard before in the past, we have a tendency to give it more credence, even if it's completely untrue, right? Like, somebody introduced a concept 10 years ago, and I have some vague memory of that concept, and somebody's now introduced it again 10 years later, and now I'm like, oh yeah, I heard that, and we assume they're right now because we heard it one time 10 years ago, and it could be completely fallacious. So that script of preference for familiarity could give birth to a conversation where we assume or accept a premise that is totally erroneous simply because our script says give preference to things that are familiar.
Yeah. So I want to pause for one moment and make a comment about when I was first learning about cognitive biases, I was massively resistant. And the reason I was resistant is, well, I'm a thoughtful person. I'm a person who thinks about my choices. I'm a person who doesn't over-assume something or assume something. And this is my showing up to the world saying, okay, cognitive biases are something other people might deal with. But for me, I'm a thoughtful person. I really spend time unpacking the data, understanding the information, and making a very logical, reasonable choice. So, people are trying to tell me that I've got these biases. I can't imagine that. Look how smart I am. Look how intelligent. Look how thoughtful I approach the world with. And, and looking at this, it's a very humbling experience when you have this moment when you wake up to the fact that, oh, I'm doing this all the time too. Okay. And in fact, my showing up to the world resisting cognitive biases is also a cognitive bias. And so this can get really, start going down layers deep, right? In fact, there is a cognitive bias to where you think you're able to spot cognitive biases in others more than the average person. And that's a cognitive bias in and of itself. So it starts getting really meta really quick, right?
Right.
I don't know. What was your experience? I think cognitive biases for you probably got you a little bit horny because you love this idea of mental stuff. For me, it was very resistant. Were you embracing them right away when you first heard about this, when you first started studying about these kind of things?
This is actually probably something Charis and I have in common. Interestingly enough, all three of us were raised in extremely religious households. Households that didn't really allow for a lot of other information to come in. And I think, Charis, you and I were talking about this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I feel like I spent my whole life in cognitive bias, but I had no idea there was such a thing. Once I started really learning what cognitive biases were and how every single belief that I had was based upon an actual cognitive bias that the rest of the world was aware of and I was not, it's really been quite eye-opening.
Well, and it was one of the things that I think when I was really graduating to the next phase of my life, medically, I think just understanding that biases existed and then going and doing some research into them and like finding lists of biases and understanding what what each one was and how they show up. I think that was maybe possibly the final nail in the coffin for me.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have an example, something you could illustrate? I mean, maybe not super personal if that's too personal, but do either one of you have an example from your lives of something that really showed up for you and you're like, oh, wow, I am totally biased in this way. And I have not, for some reason it switched on me and now I'm seeing it, but I didn't see it for years. What in the world?
Well, just the belief that you're the only ones with the truth. You're the only ones that know how the world operates, and you have the entire market on truth and belief, and everybody else is wrong. That's a pretty big cognitive bias that you base all your decisions on.
Yeah, and I think the two for me were, I think the most common bias that I see come up is confirmation bias, which is if I already believe something, I'm going to keep believing it. It's basically confirmation bias is I believe something, so I'm going to look for information that supports my belief, and I'm going to reject information that contradicts my belief. I would say confirmation bias is probably the one that's the most egregiously offended.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree with that.
And so that was a major one for me to go, how much have I really been putting my beliefs through a baptism by fire? Like, how much actual, ensuring that this is truly at the core, like something that I know to be certain, or maybe it's something I need to hold a little more loosely. So I would say confirmation bias was a big one. And I don't know if there's probably a specific bias name for the second one that I'm about to mention. I don't know what the name of it is, but if it's not an official bias name, there needs to be one. And that is a bias that I have discovered that I personally have, which is that if an argument is elegant, I have a tendency to give it more credence. Like the more elegant the argument, the more I think it, or at least at that time, believed it to be true. The problem is that I was never questioning my premise.
You mean internally logically elegant?
Exactly. Exactly. If the argument has internal logical consistency, I think it must be true. And that's not necessarily true at all. There's a lot of truths that are incredibly sloppy. And just because something is internally logically consistent after you get past the premise point doesn't mean that the premise itself is sound.
Oh, there's a great example of this. You've actually mentioned it. I don't know the story. I'm going to actually have you tell the story. It's from the show Big Bang Theory when the main character is talking about Lois Lane being caught by Superman.
Right. Yeah, that's I'm not a huge fan of the Big Bang Theory. I know a lot of people love the show. I think Big Bang Theory, just for the record, it's what people think nerds are like, right? Like, and especially intuitive thinkers.
It's a caricature of them.
It's a caricature of intuitive thinkers. And so I think I appreciate the concept of it, but I think the people who love it the most probably are not intuitive thinkers. If you want to know what intuitive thinkers are actually like, you should watch Silicon Valley. That's what they're actually like. And even they are just a little bit of a caricature of themselves. But it's much closer to reality than Big Bang Theory. And that said, the one of the main characters, Sheldon, and I think I've never really watched the show, but it's been on for many seasons, and it seems like he's basically stolen everybody's heart. Like, everybody loves Sheldon. So early on in the show, there was an episode, I guess, or actually, I hate talking about Big Bang Theory because I don't actually know what I'm talking about since I don't watch the show, but I do remember one clip, okay? One clip.
And that's all I'm referring to.
Okay.
You don't need to give us the whole history of the show. I just want
show.
the clip story.
Sorry. You threw me out of my competence because now I'm talking about something that I don't really know that much about. And so I'm like, oh crap, I have to apologize for not knowing that much about it. Anyway, so my lack of understanding or knowledge about Big Bang aside, Big Bang Theory, there's a scene that I actually use in Profiler, one of the profiler tools that I've created about men and personality types. I've grabbed a scene of Sheldon, explaining to the hot blonde neighbor, whose name has escaped me, about Superman, that they're going to do a Superman, they're going to do like a movie fest, and they asked her if she wanted to come over, and she was talking about how she wasn't really into it, but that scene where Superman catches Lois Lane as she's falling, that was a really great scene in her mind. And he goes, well, that was riddled with complete inaccuracies. And she's like, yeah, I know, men can actually fly. And he goes, no, let's pretend they can. That wasn't the inaccuracy. That wasn't the problem. It was that he's a man of steel, and if he caught her at the velocity in which she was falling, then she would be actually separated into 3 equal parts, because as a man of steel, her falling at that velocity would mean that the impact would actually create 3, she would basically be split into 3 parts. And then they argue whether or not that would be, that he could maybe account for that by matching her velocity and flying downward. And that was just as offensive to Sheldon, because there is no space for that, because he caught her 3 feet off the ground. So now the scene has turned into an argument about whether or not that is internally logically consistent. Okay, so I think the reason why you mentioned that is the argument itself, right? They're looking for the logical consistency within the argument, but the premise is false.
That men can fly.
Right.
Or Superman can fly.
Right. The premise is based on people, like the superheroes actually existing, which they do not. So that's actually a complete bias of mine, and I'm sure it's shared by other people of similar personality types to me. If the argument has logical internal consistency to it, I have a tendency to give a lot more credence, even if the premise is based on fantasy. And when I was raised with the paradigm of my youth, I found it to satisfy that internal consistency, never questioning the premise. And when I was graduating to my next phase, basically figuring out what it was that I do believe, that was one thing that really just struck me, was that I have a massive bias towards those logically consistent arguments. And so I now look for that. I scan for that. If somebody's got a really beautiful, elegant argument about something, I'll look at them and go, wow, that was really cool. And then I'll think, do I think the premise is BS? That's the first thing I ask myself, is the premise BS? I remember talking to somebody who was a friend of one of your family members, and they're evangelical, and they were talking about something that I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was some relationship between Jesus and I can't remember what the entire thing was, but just by the time he got done reading that passage of scriptures and talking about what he believed it meant, I couldn't help but admire the logic behind what the person was saying. I was like, yeah, that is a beautiful argument. I can completely see why you would believe that. That makes so much sense, the way that you explained it. And then in my mind, I'm thinking, but I don't buy the premise. So it's really the premise that we're talking about, not whether or not everything after that is logical.
Yeah. In most conversations, most debates, most disagreements, I believe, are at the premise level. We tend to move them up the ladder into the nitty-gritty details, but really if you're down to the end of it, it's often a worldview conflict. It's a premise level conflict. And obviously we have those biases that will move us away from the premise, away from the assumptions that we have in life, and move us into that granular detail.
And by the way, I don't want to indicate that I think that evangelical Christians are flat out wrong. It's not something that I've ascribed to at this point. I just really want to be cautious that I try to make space for, everybody is trying to figure out the world, as it's presented to them. And we all have cognitive biases, and our biases are going to influence everything we do. The book that I always reference is Prometheus Rising, where Robert Anton Wilson says in a couple different ways that we're all brainwashed. And what he'll do is he'll make little asterisks next to a comment that indicates the level of brainwashing we have on a conscious level and an unconscious level. And then he'll put a little asterisk next to it, and at the footnote it says, except for you, dear reader, right? Except for you. You're the only one who is the exception to the rule. And I thought that was so brilliant, because it's that's what we all do. You were talking about with reading cognitive biases and having a resistance and going, well, but I don't do that. Everybody else does that, but not me. And so when I talk about my perspective of the world, I fully recognize that I am bringing a bunch of biases in with me. And when I disagree or don't disagree with another person, that in my mind is in no way an indication of truth. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not talking about truth. I'm simply talking about, like sort of our subjective experience and what makes sense to us as we're going through the world with these biases.
The other resistance that I think came up for me early on too was, at the time, I believed in a very specific, objective version of reality that we all align ourselves against. And it wasn't until, growth in my life and years later, I'm realizing that pretty much everything is subjective in our lives. Everything comes down to a subjective experience because that's all we know. You cannot show me a reality outside of my own perception.
Yeah, if you look on the Wikipedia article and how they define cognitive biases, because there's like two really main articles. One's a list of them, and the other one is a discussion around cognitive bias. And the way that they defined it in the first paragraph almost makes it sound like when you're using a cognitive bias, they call it a deviation from logic. And you and I were talking about whether or not we agree with their premise about what a cognitive bias is. And because it was like, well, it's when you're utilizing this mental process that has you deviate from being rational and
what they determined objective reality.
Right. I don't think they termed it objective reality, but that was the impression definitely that they were giving, was a sense of like, you're turning objective reality into a subjective experience, and that makes you irrational, basically. And you were like, well, I don't know if I agree with their premise that there is an objective reality that we're trying to, the bias is deviating from objective reality. And I was like, well, if you read it in the sense that only some people are doing this some of the time, then I would disagree with the premise as well. If you read it assuming that all people are doing this all the time, I totally agree with their premise, right? Like, if you read it to go, hey, we're all doing cognitive biases, we're all creating subjective social experiences, we all have our what could be called our reality distortion tunnels. If you see it in that way, then it's like, well, there's not really an argument where you'll show up and you'll be like, well, you're just in your cognitive bias, so therefore you must be wrong. It's a matter of like, we're all doing this all the time, and how do we navigate a world understanding that we're always going to be biased?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to maybe talk about some examples that we've seen come up in our lives of some of these biases to, help you as you're listening to this really get your mind around what we're actually trying to talk about here. Especially if this is a brand new concept for you, brand new framework. So both you, Antonia, and Cheris, and me, let's come up with some examples from our lives, from our experience. We've talked about a few of them, and maybe we can also dig into some off this list and see if they apply to some of our experiences in the past, basically on some of the biases we've shown up with. I've obviously talked about some of the basic ones, like when you buy something and now you all of a sudden start noticing that product everywhere. Well, your mind is now biased towards seeing that, or we named our daughter Piper examples. That's a basic example of a cognitive bias, but they can get more sophisticated or less sophisticated depending on where you are in your life and the stages of where this shows up for you.
Yeah, and I just want to make it clear what we mean when we say cognitive bias. I think we kind of we didn't really define it earlier. We just kind of loosely talked about the concept. The technical definition is basically when a person's subjective perspective or experience, or sort of their social experience, it overrides the objective data, right? So it generates basically an irrational or an illogical conclusion because your subjectivity is overriding objective data. That's the technical definition. It's hard for me to see anything as objective, so I kind of like our definition a little bit more. And our definition is more when these scripts that are running in your mind, either scripts that are, inherited from ancient programming or learned behaviors through your family or strategies that you've picked up along the way, regardless of where you got this script, it's when the script becomes over-relied upon. And now you're using it in contexts where it would be logically inconsistent to use it. That's kind of a neutral way of defining it because we're about to enter a space where we talk about how cognitive biases have impacted us. But I think we're also going to enter a space where we talk about how cognitive biases can actually be beneficial. So I don't want to make it too judgmental sounding, like, anytime you use a cognitive bias, that's necessarily a bad thing. They have a tendency to show up badly for us. However, we can also, once we understand how this technology works, we can, as with all technologies, we can basically manipulate it for our benefits. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can do that after we go through some of these, this list and go, what are some of these biases that impact us personally?
Yeah, I mean, a basic example is this harkens back to a podcast we just did a few episodes ago. We're talking about the Baltimore City riots. The cognitive bias of stereotyping has really been coming up for me a lot lately with police officers because of some of the violence that has happened from police officers with people in various cities around the United States. I'm noticing myself looking at police officers and stereotyping them as bad motive, as maybe they're unsafe, maybe they're just looking to hurt somebody. And I'm seeing this come up more and more and more for me, where I'm seeing police officers in a bad stereotype, negative light based on recent events. And it's something I'm trying not to lump every police officer across the board into a major group together and to say, well, can't obviously describe all police officers in all times and all places. That is a stereotype cognitive bias that I'm bringing into this now based on recent events. And so that's something I'm working on right now in my life as an example.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier we could talk about biases that have impacted us in the past, but I kind of want to talk about biases that I'm dealing with right now, just like you did. Like,
Sure.
Things that are, things that are burgeoning for me. And one thing that I've noticed that happens, I think this is based on my personality type. I think based on me being an ENTP, what's technically called my inferior process, or what we call in the CAR model, my 3-year-old process, it's a mental process that's technically called introverted sensing. We call it memory. And the way that it shows up for me is that I tend to get trapped in a feeling that things are fated to be the way that they are. We talked about imago relationships and how in a past podcast about how we tend to replicate our relationships over and over so that we can learn, basically learn the lessons from them. But I have this really sort of locked in, fated, fatalistic perspective of imago relationships, in the sense that I believe that any negative experience I've had in the past is automatically going to be replicated again in the future. And I think another word that we could use for this is called projection, right? I project negative experiences from the past. I project them into my present or into the future. And there's a cognitive bias called the availability heuristic. And it's basically the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of an event from the past based on either how recent it was or how emotionally evocative it was for us. So when I'm what could be called in the grip of my less mature, less sophisticated, less developed parts of who I am, I have a tendency to really double down on this bias. I'll project, project motives onto other people that they don't have at all. But that's because I experienced them in the past with another person, and I'm terrified that's going to happen again. So I've really noticed this bias coming up for me in not even necessarily as like a normal way that I enter the world or explore the world, but a bias that I really experience when I'm in a less mature part of myself, which tells me that some of the biases that we have are ones that are with us all the time, and others lie dormant for, moments when we're actually struggling with something. And then all of a sudden now that bias rears its ugly head.
I have to say that the bias that really stood out to me is called information bias, and that's the tendency to seek information even when it cannot affect action. And I, as was mentioned, am an INFJ. And so I lead with perspectives, and my 10-year-old is accuracy. And I spend a lot more time in my TI, my accuracy, than maybe your average INFJ. So I am always looking for more information. And I just gather more and more and more. I have no idea how it's going to impact me, or even if I'm going to use it at any future date. But I have to have it just in case.
Right. I think that's really common for INJs, the information bias. Like, even when you hit a law of diminishing returns on information gathering, I think it's really common to go, but I need more, because it feels like preparation.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Another bias that comes up for me a lot when we're talking about projects or business type stuff. There's this bias called the sunk cost fallacy, where I put so much time, attention, money, effort into something and it's not working out. But man, I've invested so much. I may be just moments away from success or from it working. And it's so clear that the investment that I put into this, whether it was time, money, effort, is just not going to pan out. It's just not going to work. It's going to be broken. It's not going to function correctly. But I can't let go of it because I put so much in. It's like just a little more effort. Maybe it'll actually work.
Man, that's one of the big ones. I think after confirmation bias, which is just pretty universal, I think that sunk cost fallacy of, I've put so much in, I can't disconnect now, even if it's really painful or it looks like it's not going to pan out or it's like making me miserable. Like, look at how much I've invested. That might be one of the most common after, say, confirmation bias, is this like idea of like, well, I've already put so much time in. What am I going to do? And I think people do this with marriages. I think they do it, in relationships a lot. Relationships with paradigms, like with, your religious beliefs, or people will do this with like their jobs, right? Like their job is making them miserable, but they went to college for it. They got their degree for it. So now they're in their, they're an engineer and they really wanted to be a poet. But I mean, what are they going to do? They've spent $50,000 getting an engineering degree. So now what? So I think the sunk cost fallacy is really common.
Oh, I definitely agree with that. I also noticed the fallacy pareidolia. I see that a lot. It was mentioned that I live in Gettysburg, which Gettysburg is supposedly the most haunted town in the United States. There's 14 paranormal businesses in the town. And so you get a lot of this, the belief that people are seeing ghosts and images where there isn't anything. Pareidolia is a vague and random stimulus that our brain picks up on and creates a pattern out of based upon other things we've seen, like the man in the moon or Jesus on a piece of toast. We make patterns out of things that are familiar to us, and that's pareidolia. And you see that a lot in the paranormal field right now, people seeing things that really aren't there, but it creates this belief in them, and you cannot argue with them on it. Don't tell them, hey, I don't see that. You're the only one that sees that, because they will actually get angry at you.
Right. Well, and I think that's the point, isn't it? Is that these biases are meant to protect something. Like we're using them as a shield. Sure. I think anytime somebody tries to penetrate a bias, the general reaction is anger.
Yeah, it's a knee-jerk reaction, a protection.
Absolutely.
So as you're listening, you're probably thinking, okay, some of these are things that I've seen coming in and out of my life, and I've noticed in other people. Sometimes it's easier to notice things in other people first before we're willing to admit them to ourselves, which is also a cognitive bias. And we're sitting here talking about these examples. You guys feel like we've given some good examples? Do you feel complete on that? And we can start going down the road of really talking about the mechanics of the biases themselves?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the podcast is not intended to do like a comprehensive list of biases, although I highly recommend everybody, go check out that Wikipedia article. It's one of the best collections that I've seen, like just a really easy, quick list of biases. And go through and go, so which ones do I think I've manifested in the past? Which ones am I doing now? And in which context am I doing them? Like we mentioned, sometimes these biases are ones that live with us all the time, and sometimes they're ones that show up when we're not in our best states. And how could they be influencing us in a negative way?
So as we're talking about cognitive biases, and we look at these as unconscious trim tabs for our mind to try to get what we want in life, right? And as we're having this discussion, we're like, yeah, these are biases that come up for us that are not serving us well, is the language we might use. We might say, like, my idea of a stereotype of police officers is not serving me well because there are police officers that have good intent and are not trying to hurt people, and that's not a very helpful cognitive bias that I have. However, if we look at cognitive biases as tools in and of themselves to lead us, they're trim tabs to lead us to what we truly desire, the cognitive biases that we've employed, that have going on in our unconscious, are leading us to what I would posit are the ultimate desires of our heart, are the ultimate desires of our mind. we may not be aware of it. We may say we want happiness, but we've got cognitive biases that do not lead us toward happiness as the result. I would argue that if that's the case, you actually don't want happiness, or you would be employing biases and ways of your mind working that would lead you toward happiness and not away from happiness. Does this make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful point.
So, yeah, go
Oh,
ahead.
no, please Finish your thought, because it's powerful.
I had this other thought. So it's not so much about changing the biases that we have, because that would assume that we have biases that are running against what we really want. It's really examining and changing what it is that we truly desire at the core level that will impact the biases we use as strategies. That was my complete thought.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good complete thought. I think that's such a powerful statement, or a powerful observation, that the biases themselves will betray what is really going on in our hearts. Like, it's that whole, it seems like a false dichotomy question that we ask a lot of times. Would you rather be right, or would you rather be happy? And a lot of people are like, well, I'm happy when I'm right. And also, when you double down on being right to the point that you've alienated everybody around you, no, you've chosen right over happy, right? So the biases will show us where we would rather be right than happy. And the true desire of our heart is to be right in some way, or to reaffirm a worldview, or to ignore data, or to just basically fashion a world around us that gets us closer to being right as opposed to being happy. That would be one. I'm sure that there's other desires of our hearts that isn't happiness, or isn't rightness over happiness. It could be, that we believe our biases are helping us maintain family relationships. And that is an attempt to be happy, but it's actually going to even deeper programming, which is, I've got to stay close to my tribe. I can't get kicked out of my tribe. If I get kicked out of my tribe, I die. So it's really not about happiness in that situation either. It's actually like moving away from a fear of, being booted from a tribe. So our biases can sometimes serve us in those ways as well. Our biases can prevent us from having to make radical changes in our lives that we don't really know what the outcome would be, right? Like it allows us to stay in a position where we fear moving forward. So we create a bias, or we pull on a bias that allows us to stay, in that spot.
So a quick exercise for me then would be to sit down, and maybe if you're listening, this might be a great exercise. Sit down, look over this list of cognitive biases and start to determine, okay, yeah, I see that coming up for me. Oh, I noticed that in other people. Wait, I kind of do that too. All right, so you make like a little short list of maybe 5 to 10 biases that seem to come up for you, and say, what are these biases trying to accomplish? What is the goal that these biases are running me toward? Where are they focused around? And then examine, is this something that I am unconsciously desiring in my life that these biases are then reinforcing for me? And examine the actual thing that you desire as the thing to manipulate and work with, rather than the biases themselves. Because you're treating a symptom at the bias level where the disease or the cause of the bias is at what you actually want, or what your unconscious actually wants, because you may not actually be aware of that. So that would maybe be a really great exercise, just to kind of play with this concept. And I think of an example from my background in my very strict religious practice, the faith background that I'd come from. If a piece of information had come into my sphere that contradicted what I perceived to be the truth, I would resist seeing that piece of information. It was a bias that I had of resisting to see that piece of information, because in my mind, I said consciously, I want truth. I want to be truthful in my understanding of my faith. But if a piece of quote unquote truth came into my sphere that would contradict what I had determined was truth, I would not even allow it to come into my sphere, because I had wanted truth. And by definition, I'm actually not getting truth, because I'm removing possibilities for other information that could round out a more truthful frame for me. Is this making sense? Charis and I just had this conversation before we started recording, that I often as a EP, I talk and connections happen as I talk, and it's really difficult to form thoughts before I speak. So I'm always like, does this make sense? To make sure that as I'm talking, I thought it made sense. I want to make sure it does.
We both do that. That's kind of the point of the podcast, I think, is to clarify our thoughts through communication, through actually like hearing them out loud and going, oh yeah, I think I do believe that thing that I just said, or no, I don't believe that thing at all. So I think that's pretty common. One thing that's coming up for me as you're talking about that is you can, if you look at it as going down to the foundational, what is it I'm actually desiring and how are these cognitive biases serving that? Then I think you could also, at the same time, use cognitive biases to help you get what you want. Like, you can manipulate the technology to be a tool for good. If we're all going to be in bias pretty much most of the time, then how can we use these biases to help us not just unconsciously get what we unconsciously want, but consciously get what we consciously want? Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah, see them as the tools that they are.
Right, exactly. So what would be an example of this? What would be an example of consciously using a bias to help us get to where we consciously want to be? And I think of things like entire disciplines have been around this, I believe. I think people have created entire disciplines around biases, helping you get what you want. And the first thing that pops in my head is manifesting. Manifesting is a tool, is a discipline built entirely on a cognitive bias. Manifesting is a bias. And yet people implement manifesting to get the life that they want, right? And a lot of people are like, oh, it's just a placebo, or they'll have like a million rational arguments why manifesting is complete and total BS. And yet a lot of people who employ manifesting actually get their goal accomplished. Now, is it a bias to say that we're only looking at the people that are manifesting, they're getting their goals accomplished and using them as an example of why it works? Possibly, right? That is entirely possible. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of people who have implemented manifesting and it has paid off for them because they're over focusing on one concept. They're only seeing that thing. That's the familiarity fallacy, which is you buy a car, now you see that car everywhere. Well, if you're thinking about one thing all the time, then you're going to be seeing that thing, and then opportunities that are around that thing are going to become more and more obvious to you. So manifesting is basically an entire discipline around a cognitive bias that helps people consciously get to what they consciously want, which is, whatever you're trying to manifest.
Yeah, and I think Robert Anton Wilson, actually in a recording, but he basically said the mental technology in the Zen Buddhist practice are basically just mental games that we employ. Basically, he's talking about little cognitive biases running in our heads that lead toward greater centeredness and happiness and things of this nature. So you can see it on all levels. And it seems like, a meditative practice and thinking in terms of unattachment and like a Zen practice or discipline, that's a mental game you're doing. You're kind of tricking your mind to think in certain patterns that lead you to happiness that doesn't cause anxiety, that gives you ease through life. You feel happier, you feel more centered, you feel more grounded, you feel more connected. And these are things that like you said, they're technologies we can use. They're little mental games that can be used for good or for benefit, I should say, because good is, it puts a valutative on something.
Relative, yeah.
For benefit, and however you determine that for yourself.
Yeah, I think of when people self-identify as things like, well, I'm an optimist or I'm a pessimist. And my favorite is, I'm a realist. That's one of my favorites. They're all biases, right? Like whether or not you're choosing to see the glass as half empty, half full, or just at half, just like half, whatever that means. All of them are a bias that we gravitate towards just naturally based on our wiring and our, everything that's led us to becoming an optimist or a pessimist or whatever. And they're contextual too. Like there's a lot of things that link optimism with longer life and happiness. And then there was the study done on prisoner of war camp victims that said that the optimists were actually the ones who didn't do as well, because they kept expecting somebody to come save them, and that never happened. And so it was actually the self-proclaimed realists or pessimists that actually thrived in a prisoner of war camp. So even the biases that we assume are going to lead to better life, longer life, happiness, etc., they're contextual too. Now, I hope that none of us end up in prisoner of war camps. And in general, optimism actually is the one that's linked to a happier state of life in general. So no matter what our biases are, I think it's more a matter of looking at them, again, as tools, right? Like looking at them really as not just a way of being that is always the right way of being, but as tools for, like optimism or pessimism or whatever, but as tools for, navigating a space, navigating life, and then, again, throwing out anything that doesn't serve you. Most biases are probably not going to serve us very well. If we create a discipline around them and conscientiously use them, then they can be used for positivity or used in a positive way. But again, you just got to be thoughtful. You got to be aware, mindful, thoughtful. You can't. It's yet another example of pulling in all resources to navigate life, not being on autopilot.
The history of the human race, at least the recorded history of the human race, seems to be the history of our mental technology development. So our psychological evolution seems to be what we've recorded in our recorded human history, right? And so when I look at cognitive biases, and I think as we're wrapping this up, cognitive biases seem to be one of the first technologies that we probably developed as humans when we're starting to think in things, we're starting to think in more abstract terms like happiness and love and all these different things that our neocortex is dealing with. Cognitive biases was the first tool set we had to begin to do trim tabs on very complex thought. And it's been a useful technology, through the past. And one of the things that's really near and dear to the heart of Personality Hacker is looking at the next evolution of human psychology and human evolutionary psychology. What does that look like? And often we'll talk about things like frameworks and models. We're always referencing a framework or a model often in these podcasts. In a lot of our programs and trainings, we like to use frameworks and models, things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs or the Graves model or personality psychology in general. It gives us a place the pegs to hang concepts on that we believe, our bias is that these are more superior ways of approaching the world than just a cognitive bias, a stereotype or a way of trim tabbing something in our mind, because this gives us more of a contextual element to it. Like you said, optimism is contextual. This bias toward optimism is very contextual. A framework almost removes the content and allows that framework to be applied in various contexts, depending on the situation you're in. Yeah,
exactly. I would totally agree with that. In fact, one of the things that came up for me while we were talking about this list of biases is there's a bias that it always annoys me, even though I'm sure that I do it too. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. I think it's Krieger. It could be Kruger. Anyway, the Dunning-Kruger effect, which basically says that people who don't know what they're talking about are going to massively overvalue their insight on something, and the people who are experts are going to massively undervalue their expertise and their insight. So effectively the armchair quarterback who just assumes that they know how to, that they're the person who should have actually been in the game, even though they're like 20 pounds overweight and like eating chips while they're watching the game, that person massively overvalues their ability to like yell like instructions at the refs or at the coaches. Whereas somebody who is, the actual coach at the sidelines of this professional, football game is doubting themselves or could be doubting their decisions, right? So this is a normal bias. And I thought, man, if you just understood the competency model, I think we've talked about it in previous podcasts. The competency model is 4 quadrants, where you start out in a quadrant when you're first learning a skill. It's called unconscious incompetence, which is that guy sitting on his lazy boy, like assuming he knows the game better than the people who are professionals, right? Like he doesn't know how much he doesn't know. And then once you start learning a skill and you've been doing it a while enough to go, oh, wow, there's a lot to learn here, you move into a quadrant called conscious incompetence, which is you actually know how little you know. And then as you build the skill, eventually you move into what's called conscious competence, which is you know how to do it now. You've got a lot of insight under your belts, you've got a lot of experience here, but you have to be thoughtful about it. You still have to pull in a lot of thinking around it. It's not just muscle memory. And then eventually, having done it long enough, you move into what's called unconscious competence, which is now it's muscle memory. You don't even have to think about it. It's just something you can do. And if people were actively thinking, hey, so in this particular skill that I'm criticizing another human being about, what is the reasonable quadrant that I personally fall into? I'm sitting on my lazy boy and I'm eating like potato chips all afternoon. I'm probably unconsciously incompetent here. And an expert that goes, hey, I've clocked 10,000 hours or more in this, I'm probably unconsciously competent. So having a model around this is sort of an antidote to the bias. You're able to work with this concept of like, well, should I be so insecure? Well, actually I've clocked quite a few hours. I probably am at a point where, This is muscle memory for me. So I'll go ahead and be confident in my decisions. So with almost all of these cognitive biases, there is a map or a model that can be employed to go, so what's a more reasonable way of looking at this? Maybe I can, instead of, there's a cognitive bias about how you underestimate the value of emotions in both yourself and others. One of the ways, and this is a bias that I am completely guilty of, one of the ways that I've learned how to get past that is through understanding personality types, understanding how feelers work, understanding how emotions impact people of different personality types, understanding that I'm a person who is highly likely to underestimate the power of emotions. That model has almost killed that bias for me, which has been great. So most of these biases have an antidote. The ones that are not serving us contextually have an antidote in a map or a model.
Can you imagine if politicians showed up to the world ridding themselves of biases or as much as possible and really working inside frameworks, trying to understand actual problems inside frameworks? Or can you imagine a news media, one of the news media channels, cable news channels, instead of just having a bunch of people yelling back and forth at each other in a debate, they create a framework around the information they're trying to dissect and solve a problem around, and we'd actually start seeing some problem solved. And we can see why people wouldn't do this, because obviously they're tools. They're useful for us internally, but they're also useful for us externally to use these cognitive biases. They whip people into a frenzy. They're used to manipulate people. But can you imagine a world where we have frameworks that we're dealing with, and it starts to get more neutral on neutral grounds? Now, we have a massive cognitive bias toward frameworks, and we make no apology for that.
That's true.
We think that would solve a lot of problems if people began to think in framework terms. We believe that would be very useful, and that's a bias of ours that we bring to the table. And I'm at least somewhat aware of that bias that I bring here. And I like I said, I make no apology for that bias that I have.
Yeah, I'm pretty okay with that one. I'm all right with having that bias.
You might not see it in politicians or in the news media, but what about in your own life? You're listening to this. And, I gave you that little exercise a little earlier about writing down some of those biases. Well, are there some frameworks that you can begin to employ in your everyday life when you're fighting with your lover or spouse, for example, and things are heated, and now you've got these biases coming up based on your past or your past together or things in your life and things in their life? Wait a minute, maybe there's a framework here I can apply instead of just relying on old mental trim tabs. This framework might actually solve the solution, or it might get us to a solution better than just trim tab thinking. What can I use right here in this situation? If you could just start training yourself to ask that question, is there a framework for the situation I'm in right now? That would open up a whole world of possibilities for you.
Well, and then also what you said earlier, which is questioning your outcome. Making sure that the thing that you want is the thing that you want. You mentioned before that a businessman who is unconsciously self-sabotaging because he really doesn't actually want to grow his business. It's at a level that he's comfortable with. And that's what the secret desire of his heart is. And so he employs lots of biases to keep him there. So what is the unconscious secret desire of your hearts in a context like you were just talking about with marriage, like your relationship with your spouse? Is it really to get to a point where you have harmony and simpatico and a great relationship? Or is there something else that, not that you want to be unhappy, however, is there some ancillary goal that is taking precedence, over the happiness and harmony that you want in your marriage? So being aware of your what is up to this point, your unconscious goal, making those goals conscious, and then moving those to something that more serves you, and then reviewing your biases, and then asking which ones you happen to do, in good moments, and then the ones that you do in bad moments, and then asking yourself what model would serve you. It sounds really complicated, but it's actually just a process of steps. What are my unconscious goals? Can I make them conscious, and can I change them? What are my cognitive biases, and which frameworks can I employ instead to get me to what I want to have as my conscious goal?
We want to hear from you. Again, this is a discussion starter, not a discussion ender. Where is this happening for you? What's coming up for you as we're talking? We love the fact you're part of these podcasts. And we actually love the fact that Cheris came on board today and joined in with us too.
Thank you very much, Cheris. And actually, if you're part of the Personality Hacker Tribe, you're probably going to hear Cheris's voice quite a bit coming up in the future in some projects that we're working on. You're probably going to see her in, her name in some emails. And so get familiar with Cheris because she's becoming more and more She's actually becoming one of those people that if she left at this point, we would just crumble in the fetal position and cry and suck our thumbs.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So.
But thanks, Charis, for being with us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And we want you to join in with us in our growing community of personality hacker people that think just like you. They're not just exactly like you, but we have a lot of likeness of mindset, and we are looking to solve some of the same problems in the world and grow ourselves in the same ways. So you can find us over at personalityhacker.com, yes, the main website, of course, but also facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack.
And if you enjoy our podcast, you can subscribe to it and also leave feedback on iTunes. Not only a rating, but a review, because reviews are always lovely to read.
Absolutely. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.